Hey, what's up, folks? This is GK. So, if you're wondering what is platform engineering, what problems it is trying to solve, how is it different from DevOps or SRE? Is it a new marketing buzz that is being used by companies to sell their products? So, all these questions are answered in this podcast. So, I had a wonderful time talking to Luca, who is a product owner at Humanitech, and he has shared the wealth of knowledge around platform engineering, which otherwise you have to spend a lot of money to understand this. So enjoy this podcast, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section. There's going to be another video about the platform engineering at enterprise scale. Do watch for that video as well. I hope you're going to enjoy this podcast. Do you think this will diminish the responsibility of a DevOps engineer at an enterprise? Hey, Luca, thank you for joining this conversation with me, this podcast. And this is the second podcast I'm having on the platform engineering. It's awesome to have you here. Somebody from the platform engineering background who has immense knowledge on the platform engineering, and I've read your articles. It's awesome to hear from you because there are a lot of confusions around what exactly is platform engineering, and is it a new marketing buzzword that a lot of companies are coming up with to buy their platforms. So I hope that we're going to clear all those misconceptions or everything about platform engineering. Thanks for joining this podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm sure hoping we can clear up most of those, uncertain things around platform engineering.
Awesome. And could you please briefly introduce yourself to the audiences here?
Sure. So I'm Luca. I run product and growth at Humanitech. I think most people know me within kind of like the DevOps space for being a core contributor to the platform engineering community. I moderate the platform engineering Slack that has over 9,000 members. I host PlatformCon, which has been the first ever conference about platform engineering that we ran last year for the first time. We're going to do PlatformCon 23 this year. I write a newsletter, Platform Weekly, that goes out to I think like 6,000 or 7,000 people at this point. And yeah, so I'm just really active in the sort of like DevOps industry and space around specifically the concepts of platform engineering and building platforms and internal developer platforms or IDPs.
Awesome. And I'm also part of the community, by the way. It's one of the best communities you'll have, maybe one of the rare communities around platform engineering. Lots of good tech people around it, people sharing their ideas. I'll give you the link in the description so that you can also join. And talking about the platform engineering itself, Luca, I know I have read your articles. I just want you to repeat for the audience here and for myself as well. Is this a buzzword, or is this a real thing, the whole platform engineering?
Great question. So I guess like let's start with what is platform engineering. So platform engineering, in my view, is the art of essentially designing and binding together all the different techs and tools, especially in the enterprise, into a golden path, right? So design that golden path by gluing together all the different tech and tools in the enterprise. And by doing that, enabling developer self-service and reducing cognitive load on the individual contributor, on the developer. And so the sum of these golden paths is most often referred to as an internal developer platform or IDP. And the IDP is the product that is built, and product is really the key word here, that is built by the platform engineering team or internal platform team, however you want to call it, to improve developer experience and enable developer self-service and so on. And so the key principle that we advocate for in the community is this idea of building and shipping your platform as a product, which means from the perspective of the platform team, you need to treat developers as customers, and you are really focused on shipping that product, as opposed to, if you look at something like SRE or DevOps or more traditional infrastructure roles, that they were more focused on the reliability and scalability and maintainability of systems. This is really about building and shipping a product, a platform. And I think to answer your question around, is this a buzzword? Is this like, why should I care if I listen to this, right? Like, why is this not just like yet another way of reframing the same concepts that we've been used to for the last 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
So then to answer that question, I think we should go back in the last 10 years, right? And
Right.
if you look at the world, how it was about a decade ago, it was very different, right? Like we used to mainly develop monoliths, maybe running on bare metal. The infrastructure that you were deploying to was extremely less complex, right? There was no Kubernetes, no GitOps, no CNCF, crazy tooling landscape of, a million plus tools nobody can keep track of. And so at that time, DevOps came to be, right? And the initial idea behind DevOps was a really good one, right? It was to remove the barriers between developers and operations and facilitate collaboration and address this like throwing over the fence code problem, right?
Right.
So that's really great. The problem is that what happened in reality is that you had all these trends converging at the same time as, DevOps started being a thing, right? So you had Kubernetes, you had infrastructure as code, Terraform, all those things. You had, GitOps, you have all your different like cloud native, tooling and trends converging together. At the same time as we decided to, hey, let's like shift everything left into the developer basically and have them do everything, right? Like the core tenet of DevOps is you build it, you run it, do the whole thing end to end. And so that just doesn't work, right? The reality, the day-to-day of a lot of engineering teams is you have developers completely stuck, right?
Mm.
Because now, again, just to do a simple change to an application and deploy that change to an environment that you want to, maybe let's say the preview environment that you spin up, even just those words, right? Like actually in the reality of a mid-sized to large-size enterprise, it's almost inconceivable for a developer to be able to do that on their own. Because now all of a sudden, you need to touch, instead of like one or two different pieces of tooling, maybe like 10 pieces of tooling and 5 different scripts, like a Helm chart here and a Terraform module over there, and maybe some like weird YAML over here that you don't really understand. And and there's an immense amount of cognitive load that gets created on top of, on the developer.
Yep.
And it just becomes really overwhelming, right? Because you're like, I don't want to screw this thing up. And you need to be an expert in every one of those tools and
Right.
really in depth understand each one of those scripts to be able to do those changes, right? So clearly that's not really scalable, right? And on the other side of the equation, in engineering org, you have the ops team, or DevOps team that is basically fighting what we call ticket ops the whole time, right? So it's getting all this inbound requests from developers. They're like, hey, I need, a Postgres provisioned, or I need an environment spun up to do some tests. And they just constantly need to like fight this ticket ops, put out fires, and frankly, do really repetitive work as well, which is not very, engaging or interesting. It's just like, oh, let me spin up the 10th environment this week, right? But the problem is it just becomes the system doesn't let developers do this on their own, right? And so you have this reality that is really frustrating on both sides, right? You still have a fence effectively, right? And you have developers really frustrated. They need to wait. They're overwhelmed. There's a lot of cognitive load on them on the one hand, and on the other one, you have ops team that basically become a bottleneck and are constantly stressed out and try to survive and cannot focus on the high value, high reward, the more interesting activities like, optimizing your production environments, whatever, instead of like, let me spin up, let me provision again another Postgres. So
yeah,
that's the reality of DevOps for the vast majority of engineering organizations that we've spoken to, that we see in the community. We run a lot of surveys as Humanitech, where we, speak with like thousands of engineering teams of all sizes, and that's what we've found. So now, the concept of platform engineering is not a new one, and certainly not anything that we've come up with. It's something that has emerged naturally, especially especially at the beginning, among pretty advanced engineering organizations, right? So we're talking about the Googles, the Airbnbs, the Spotifys, and so on of the world, that when this whole thing started, right? Again, looking back 10 years ago, DevOps is a thing. Werner Vogels is talking about it on stage when they announced AWS in 2006. And at the same time, Kubernetes gets open sourced by Google, and all these things happen at the same time, right? All these people realize, hey, we need to onboard hundreds or thousands of developers every month, right?
Yeah.
There's no way we can expect all of these people to onboard to an increasingly complex cloud native setup and understand everything end to end. Like, this is just not a thing. And so they understood, okay, we need to build some sort of platform layer here in between the operation side of things, infrastructure teams, and the developers, to enable developer self-service so that developers can, just like operate, like actually do you build it, you run it, right? But through this platform layer, and operations don't need to fight this ticket ops and can actually live a normal life on their own, right?
Yep.
And so that's what platform engineering really is about. Platform engineering is really about true you build it, you run it, is about really enabling real DevOps for the first time. And that's what is so exciting about.
And thank you, Luca. So that was a very good explanation about the whole platform engineering concept. I think it gives the clear picture from a DevOps engineer perspective, and then as well as from the SRE engineer perspective. I'm sure this is going to be a blessing for the developers, so it's a clear win there. But now the fear is that, so let's say that we build this abstraction or a product that sits in between the developer for creating a Docker image or anything. It's a self-service model, right?
Right.
They just click on something, the workflow initiates, they get the Docker image, build done, deploy, all awesome. So then do you think this will diminish the responsibility of a DevOps engineer at an enterprise scale? Because as you know, lots of companies keep hiring DevOps engineers because they want them to build these pipelines, in a different portfolios of a big enterprise, right? Each portfolio have their own DevOps engineer, or an application team will have their own. So then if you're building this product or productizing this whole platform of CI/CD or DevOps, then what would be the role of a DevOps engineer?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And there's two answers to that. So one is, will you finally do interesting things, right? As I was mentioning earlier, you're not fighting these constant ticket ups and really repetitive tasks, but you actually, hey, let me optimize, our load balance across different regions, across different clusters, and just like, more interesting problems that actually require like human ingenuity and creativity.
Yeah.
So that's on the one hand. But then on the other, you'll see like some of these DevOps folks migrating into platform engineering, because probably that's already partially what they've been doing, right?
Yeah.
And so again, like platform engineering doesn't replace, DevOps. Although again, I think like we all know the idea of having a team that's called DevOps team is in itself a bit of a contradiction, but like whatever, that's what it is now, right? But that DevOps ops infrastructure SRE thing is still very much needed, right? Like you still need to like set up your infrastructure, optimize for scalability, maintain it, yada, yada, yada. Like that's still all there. What we advocate for though is, and like something that we can get into later as well, is like, what's the size, right? Of an engineering org at which this matters. But if you are a certain size, if you're your mid-size, large-size enterprise engineering org, then it really makes sense to, in parallel of these existing teams, also spin up one or multiple platform teams, right? And then what that platform team does is, radically different, and it's really, building a product, which is the platform. And what becomes so important, I mean, something that you mentioned was this like abstraction, right, for the developer. What becomes so important is, that this platform team really builds that really tight feedback loop with the rest of the engineering org, which is again their customers, the developers, right? And so and they need to do that in order to ship a product that developers end up using. And a key proxy for successful adoption that we've seen is nailing the level of abstraction, right? And so how do you do that? Well, again, you talk to people, right? So communication becomes a really key part of the skill set of a platform engineer, more than, a DevOps infrastructure engineer before them, and more than a sysadmin back in the days, right? So if you were to plot them on a graph, you'd see like sysadmin, your SRE, DevOps, and then platform engineer, and it would go up to the right if you had like sort of communication skills on the y-axis, and I guess like time on the x-axis. But so communication becomes so important because you really need to figure out what is the right level of abstraction for different types of users across different types of teams, right? So as an example, you could have a senior backend engineer that really enjoys messing around with their YAML scripts, right? Now, if you were to build some sort of like click UI thing on top of your delivery setup, they would feel extremely abstracted away and like they lost all control over their job, basically, right? And so you're going to get huge pushback, and likely your platform initiative is going to fail, right? Now, at the same time, you might also have a junior front-end engineer that doesn't care whether you're running on EKS, GKE. In fact, they don't even care whether you're running Kubernetes at all, right?
Exactly.
They just want to know, hey, I just want to deploy CA change, test things out, done. And so for them, this like click thing, a click hops sort of thing might be a simpler UI might be a path, right? And so whatever is and I will caveat this little comment by saying, in general though, what we have seen is developers love code-based workflows. So in general, UI heavy platforms fail. But that's just an example to say, hey, you really need to like figure out what's the right level of abstraction and what's the right level of context that you want to, and you can do this also like entirely code-based, right? By giving more or less access to more or less complex things to developers. And really, and so that's what I was talking about at the beginning, right? Really figuring out what those different golden paths are, right? And each team will have a different golden path, and then the superset of those golden paths is the IDP.
Makes sense. Totally makes sense. And like you rightly said, the tougher the abstraction is going to be, or especially at an enterprise where you have 50,000 plus employees, and if you're not able to create an abstraction that is in liking for one portfolio, then you will have the pushbacks, and then you will get into this whole ticket model again. Now, before DevOps engineers used to get tickets, now platform engineers will get a lot of tickets on fixing their abstraction.
Exactly.
And sorry. So now, when we were talking about IDPs, as you are currently working at Humanitech, right? And there is a backstage. Are these IDPs in a way, just from a DevOps engineer perspective, right? Like for a common DevOps engineer who is watching this podcast, is it misconception to say that platform engineering is nothing but prioritizing Jenkins for CI, as an example, or prioritizing GitLab CI and just creating one big like auto-scalable Jenkins server, and then just giving away access to all the developers across the company of 20,000 plus employees? So what would be the right answer for those people who are thinking in that way?
Yeah, again, I think platform engineering is really about building the glue, across your enterprise setup. to enable developer self-service and to design and build this golden path for developers, right?
Mm.
And so it's not just about kind of like productizing productizing your Jenkins, right? It's a much broader conversation. So if you think about what do you if you think about like how a platform team starts, right? You basically have two scenarios. You have greenfield and brownfield.
Yeah.
And greenfield is, I think, what mistakenly people would assume is the best scenario, right? Where they say, oh, hey, I'm a brand new platform engineering team in a brand new, I mean, maybe not a brand new company, but like, we can pick whatever we want, right? We can design our ideal stack, we can design our ideal platform, and then have developers build on it. And you'd assume like, oh, that's great because you can, start from scratch and take the best of the best and whatever. But the reality set is actually it's better to start brownfield in an already existing setup,
Yeah,
where you already have different dev teams with where each team has their own preferences, right? So you'll have the team that enjoys Jenkins, but you also have the team that enjoys Argo CD
right.
with something else, and yada yada yada, right? And so or these guys use like Flax CD plus the Circle CI. That's the reality of the enterprise. Is a lot of different teams have a lot of different delivery setups, and usually
Yeah,
there's like very little standardization across the entire org. And so what your job is as a platform team is look at all of this landscape and understand, A, what is the minimum common denominator that I can start with? And
mm-hmm.
then B, really, again, build those really tight. That's why communication is so important. And it's not just about, oh, let me like build a platform on top of Jenkins. Like,
Yeah,
let me listen. And that's what most people don't do, is listen and like iterate on feedback to ship a product. You're shipping a product. You're not building an infrastructure like you
right.
used to, right? And that's the key difference between your kind of like old school infrastructure DevOps engineering and platform engineering. Platform engineering is about building a product. And if you have ever shipped a product in a competitive market, right? And this is why, we have seen, for instance, a very large organizations like a Salesforce, multiple platform teams competing with each other. And that's obviously like an ideal scenario, although something that a lot of, companies cannot afford for a resource constraint kind of reason. But you're really competing not just on the quality of the product, but on distribution, on internal marketing, right?
Yeah,
On stakeholder buy-in on different levels. Like these things are really, really important, right? And is really what makes or breaks a platform initiative, right? So it's not just about, again, like go and dream up like your ideal like platform stack. Like it's irrelevant if you don't go and listen to developers and really iterate on it, which is why paradoxically it's actually best to start in a kind of messy brownfield setup where
yeah,
you at least can already get a feeling for what developers are using, what's the lay of the land, and what you can start building this minimum common denominator around. And then, the next question is like, where do you start from? And, we have seen, for instance, a lot of successful platform initiatives start from usually the sort of more advanced parts of the org. So the more advanced teams that are probably the most familiar with, cloud native technologies and are not afraid of handling IAC and Helm charts and stuff like that.
yeah,
And then from there, kind of, roll out progressively to less advanced teams and then start building those more abstracted scenarios for those less advanced teams, right? But you really want to start from kind of the bottom line and lower levels of abstractions.
Yep, that makes sense, Luca. Thank you. And so let's talk a bit about the IDP itself, right? Whether backstage or Humanitech. So how does these IDPs make the platform engineer's life easy in gluing the components or giving that one interface abstraction that we kept talking about to the developer so that their life is going to be much easier. I mean, I think that's the whole point of the platform engineering, I guess, anyways, right? To make the developer life experience much better, end of the day.
Correct. Yeah. So let's start maybe with what is an IDP? So an IDP, or internal developer platform, again, is the sum of all the tech and tools that a platform engineering team binds together to pave this golden path for developers, right? And so to your point, IDPs lower cognitive load across the engineering org, enable developer self-service, and crucially, they do so without abstracting away context from developers, right? Or making this underlying tech and tools inaccessible for them, right?
Yeah.
And then a well-designed IDP follows this platform as a product approach, where you continuously sort of like build, maintain, improve, following just traditional project management principles and best practices, right? Like you build this feedback loop with developers, right? So that's what an IDP is. Now, I think what's really important to mention is Backstage is not an IDP. Backstage is a portal that sits on top of an IDP, right? And there is actually I think is a software engineering's leader guide to improving DevOps, which is a really foundational piece by Manju Bhatt. He's like a VP at Gartner. And they published this piece where they clearly define, hey, an internal developer portal, which is what Backstage is, and obviously the naming doesn't help, right? It can be quite confusing, but really the difference is portal versus platform, right? An internal developer portal or a service catalog like Backstage is really just an interface, right, through which developers can discover and access an IDP, an internal developer platform capabilities, right? So that's the key difference, right? And so you can think of Backstage as a UI basically on top of your internal developer platform, right? And the internal developer platform being really that like key platform layer at the heart of an enterprise engineering org. And so if you take this a step, if you go a level deeper with this, right? Like, and you take what is Humanitech and what is Backstage, and again, we have like tutorials and videos, and I can send you a couple to link to in the show notes. But we work really closely with the Backstage folks. So I think Backstage is a great product, but it is really different from Humanitech. So Humanitech is a platform orchestrator. And a platform orchestrator, you can think of it as the core configuration engine at the heart of your internal developer platform, right? So and then Backstage is really this kind of UI on top of that platform. And I think the mistake that a lot of teams make is that, and this oftentimes can be a management top-down type of issue, right? Where they look at the engineering org performance and they say, hey, we need to improve developer experience. Or this kind of like catch-all statements. And then they're like, all right, where do we start? And they look at the developer sort of day-to-day workflow from a chronological perspective, right? And then they say, okay, where do they start? Well, they start by creating a service, and then they need to like do some changes, and then they need to deploy this service and to dev, and then promote it to production, and so on and so forth, right? And they go through the whole flow. And then the mistake that they make is like, all right, great, we need to improve developer experience. Let's start from point A, like from zero. And so that's where Backstage comes in, really, right? It's around kind of like the reusability of a service, scalability of a service, which, and again, I think Backstage is a great product for very, very large organizations. That's why it comes from Spotify. It's usually not that useful for kind of like your mid-size organizations. And we see a lot of that in the community around a confusion around like, how can I really make this like very valuable for me? But it really solves that initial step, right? Now, the issue is you are looking at this just chronologically. You're not layering on top of this workflow. Where is the max pain for developers? And max pain is very rarely at this top, right? Like at this top part of the workflow. The max pain is like the whole configuration management problem, right? Like how do I handle all configurations across my delivery setup? How do I handle all the scripts? How do I handle infrastructure orchestration? Yada yada yada. That's like where really rubber meets the road, and developers are overwhelmed, and ops are overloaded, and yada yada yada. Everything that we talked about earlier. And so if you look at it from kind of like a pain / where the value lies perspective, we believe that, Backstage kind of like solves that initial bit, but really delivers like, 5% of the value. But the vast majority, like 80% of the problem and the value can be delivered is around configuration management. And that's where the platform orchestrator comes in and solves a lot of these problems around how you handle this configuration files, and how you let developers self-serve tech and tools in a streamlined way. And then specifically what Humanitech, and we don't need to get too deep into Humanitech itself, but specifically what Humanitech provides is dynamic configuration management. And so we're the only tool out there on the market, really, when it's vendor open source, that does that. Because everyone else, every other tool is basically letting you manage configuration statically, which means every time a developer wants to make a change, right? Yeah. And you can imagine you have a bunch of different static configuration files for each environment. Every time I need to make a change, I need to go and change across all of them. And then that quickly sprawls to hundreds or thousands of static configuration files that are all over the place and become really hard to manage, really hard to track. And that's what's painful, right? What the platform orchestrator does, what Humanitech does, is it lets you specify, on an environment agnostic basis, what your workload needs to run. And then at deployment time, on the fly, it creates configuration files dynamically, which solves this whole issue of sprawling static configuration files, and then lets you do things like diffs and rollbacks and all this sort of things really easily. So that's just like an aside. And so to go back to your question, like something like Backstage and Humanitech can work really, really well together. Like, again, I'll link something in the show notes, but basically you can imagine a flow where you pick a service in your service catalog, and then you go deploy it, right? And that happens in the background through the platform orchestrator engine. And then data from the deployments, like your DORA matrix and so on, is fed back into like a UI like Backstage, right? And that kind of like closes the circle. So they complement each other really well, actually.
Oh, that totally makes sense. And in fact, this is the first time I got more clarity about IDP, as in internal developer portals versus platform, because all the while I thought they both are same. In fact, I was thinking that Backstage is a competitor for Humanitech or something of that sort, but looks like it is not. It's not the competitor at all. Okay.
No, not at all.
Thanks, Luca. So that gave a lot of insight into the IDP itself. But if I look at it, right, I mean, does it actually suit only the enterprises? Because a lot of these problems that we've been talking about might not sound familiar if you have only 20-member developer team. Maybe if you are having 10,000 plus, or typical issues with as you know, enterprises is the same thing. They have multiple platforms, multiple tools, lots of things to collect for analytics and all those things. So do you think that that's the only way? I mean, that's the right fit, the IDP?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something we sort of like hinted at earlier, which is, what's the cutting point, right? That's a question that a lot of people have. And I think, from what we've seen in the community, it seems that the number that most people sort of agree on as a rule of thumb is about 50 developers, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, we've certainly seen IDPs also built with Humanitech, for instance, for teams smaller than that. But usually it's really about, kind of like your mid-size, large-size enterprise, hundreds of developers, even thousands of developers, really. That's when, the larger the scale, the more these pain points are felt that
Yeah.
IDPs alleviate, right? And that developer self-service and so on alleviates. And so that also, I think, is an interesting segue to a broader conversation around which I think is also helpful in the framework of what we were just talking about around sort of like backstage and so on. Because another, I think, point of confusion for a lot of people is kind of like your PaaS type of tooling versus IDP, right?
Yeah.
And so if we dive into that for a second, what an IDP is really kind of, if you will, an evolution of a PaaS, but for the enterprise. What does that mean? That a PaaS, and if you look at a PaaS, like obviously historically, the kind of like one of the OGs would be Heroku, right? And nowadays you still have some Heroku. You have a lot of other
or the cloud-based.
alternatives. Yeah, all the cloud-based alternatives, they're like also like very specific to like different use cases, like e-commerce and so on and so forth. Or it's a really quite like diversified vertical. But what a PaaS product team effectively says, it's like, hey, what a Heroku's product team said like a decade ago or so was like, hey, I've looked at the entire market and I've figured out what the minimum common denominator is for a platform, and here it is. And they ship it to you and they give it to you, and it's very opinionated, right? And it gives you very little wiggle room around, how you can customize and so on. And so that is great in terms of removing that cognitive load, both from developers and operations in a greenfield, relatively simple setup, right? But it just doesn't scale. And that, if you look at Heroku's story, at some point the growth just like flattened out because they couldn't get into enterprise because it just doesn't scale at the enterprise, right? When you have to, build all the different golden paths and all those different abstraction levels that we talked about earlier, right? And so what platform engineering then advocates for is, hey, we provide, broadly in the community, we provide a platform team an unopinionated toolbox to go and build opinionated platforms, right? But the key difference is the opinionated platform is your platform, because you as the platform team are the best possible set of people in the world to know what the right level of abstraction is and what the right type of glue is for your different tech and tools, right? And so there is no way that a product can sort of be turnkey for all these different types of enterprises when everybody's a special snowflake, as we know, right? And so that's really the key difference, right? Like an IDP gives you PaaS-like functionality, but crucially is the product, again, of a collaboration between the platform team and the development team, the users, right? To create the right level of abstraction for you, the right level of context that are provided to different types of developers and users, and the right type of golden paths, right? And so that's really the difference. And so if you were to go back to your question, right, like a PaaS is, PaaS or PaaS-like solutions, all the new kind of like sort of like new gen PaaS that we see emerge, often are really targeted at your kind of like 10, 20, 30 people's teams, right? Greenfield setups, very simple, right? When you go above that, sort of like 50 or so thresholds, that's when you start needing 1, 2, 3 platform engineers, a platform team, and really then you're building an IDP. And so you're leveraging this unopinionated by itself toolbox that is provided to you, which is a mix of vendor tooling like Humanitech and open source tools like Argo, Backstage, and so on. And you put them together in in opinionated offering for your developers that makes the most sense specifically for your org.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think we have seen the stats that the PaaS never worked in enterprises. I mean, a lot of enterprises tried, even they tried OpenShift. Maybe in bits and pieces, whoever liked Kubernetes, they used OpenShift in maybe 1 or 2 applications or something like that. But as long as you have an opinionated approach, it's going to be a political tussle in enterprises. Nobody would like that
Right.
approach.
Right.
Everybody will have their own favorite tools. I think that's where IDPs would help them to create orchestration around multiple tools, not the tool itself, but to make it better for the developers using this orchestration. Totally makes sense.
Exactly. And really figure out what's that wiggle room, right? Like, and find that right balance between standardization by design and, not removing too much context from developers.
Right. Now, since we spoke about enterprises, like, as you know, for last few years, starting from 2012, 13 to today, till today, they have spent lots of money on the digital transformation, getting away from monoliths to microservices and deploying that to Kubernetes, right? And recently, Gartner report said that, okay, 2023 is going to be, I think the platform engineering is one of the topic that was mentioned in the Gartner.
It is, yeah.
That it's going to increase in 23. Now, the question is, given the market and everything the way it is, do you think enterprises would even spend money on now building these platforms, IDPs, to get into that mode? Because so far they have done the DevOps, they have gone to an extent of building huge Jenkins, CIs, CDs, and all those tools. And if you want to call them as a platforms, there are platform teams, but managing the tools, the infrastructure. But now, are they going to invest in the IDP? And what are the, KPIs that enterprises would look at if they have to put 1 million or 2 million for next 1 or 2 years, or even more?
Totally. Yeah. So look, I think it's a great question and very relevant to the times and sort of like macro, environment that we live through right now. It's 100%. I think like a platform initiative is really what gets you out of the woods, right? Is it improves the efficiency of your org, the velocity of your development teams massively, right?
Yeah.
And how do you measure it? Well, you can just stick to DORA metrics, right? Like lead time, deployment frequency, change failure rate, MTTR, all those things improve across the board, right? And obviously developer self-service, less ops overhead, less ticket ops, right? You improve on SLOs metrics, right? Like security, stability, reliability as well. And then I think like one thing that is a little bit more ephemeral and less like quantitative maybe to track, but just like frustration goes down, right? Like right now you just have this huge amount of frustration in the system, right? Between developers and operations team, where everybody's kind of just like waiting, everybody's stuck some way or another. And all of that goes away. And developers can really just focus on what they do best, what you hire them for, right? So instead of having a senior backend engineer who's stuck doing what we call shadow ops, right? Like basically working as an ops somehow for their dev team, you have like your most expensive resources stuck doing that. All of a sudden, they can actually ship features, right? So that unblocks a huge amount of value for your org. And then on the flip side of that, you have ops, platform teams, again, being able to focus on high value activities instead of just like repetitive tasks. And so it really just unblocks a ton of value across the board. And especially if you're an enterprise, this is huge right now.
Right. And I think the SLOs and SLIs would improve probably on the infrastructure side, but now we are going to have SLOs and SLIs at the platform level as well, right? Because you have the operations engineers who are actually, now the whole button is on IDPs. Else the shit will hit the fan if something goes wrong there.
Correct.
Thank you again, Luca, for all the insights. So one final question I have is your final thoughts for both DevOps engineers or who are the developers or the ops engineers who would like to become a platform engineer, and then your final thoughts for the companies who would like to invest into the platform engineering. I think which you have covered in the previous question, but maybe if you want to cover more about the platform engineers itself, because that's where my audience are more interested. How can they make career out of this?
Totally. I think it's a great question. I mean, as I said, so on the company front, I think if you are 50 developer plus, you need to look at platform engineering. This is really how you make your developers and ops people life better, happier, and you know, you just really cut your time to market massively. So in the situation where we are right now, where people are focusing on cutting the fat and focusing on what matters, platform engineering is a really good tool to sharpen your pencils across the board. So that's one. In terms of the individual perspective,
yeah,
I mean, obviously, you know, you should have a solid understanding of Kubernetes, IAC, cloud native tooling in general, CI/CD workflows, GitOps, yada yada yada, right?
yeah.
But if you come from a DevOps or SRE position, you probably already have this, right? I think the key shift that needs to happen is really a mindset one, and is what we talked about already, which is product. You need to start thinking you're building a product. And if you come from, you know, maybe not 10 years of infrastructure, then probably that's a much easier kind of ask to make. If you are a more seasoned sort of sysadmin type and you are more used to that sort of, you know, way of thinking, that maybe it, you know, it requires a little bit more work. But, you know, again, on the flip side, you've probably already built some sort of platform internally anyways. You know, another thing that I can link in the show notes is an article that Casper, our CEO, wrote, I believe it was him, around, hey, if you don't build your platform, it will build itself, right? And so that's the key thing, is taking ownership of that platform engineering initiative. And the way you do that is through this product mindset. And then, as I said earlier, also communication, right? You not only need to market your internal developer platforms to developers to ensure adoption and build that tight feedback loop we talked about a few times now, but in many cases, you also need to sell up to management, executives, get full stakeholder buy-in. You know, in some cases, as we said, maybe you're competing with other platform initiatives in the same org, right? You need to train people. So it's really communication and product mindset. Those are the two things that sound like, you know, more like soft skills, but really it's where it's at.
Awesome. Thanks, Luca. I mean, this is amazing session. I really enjoyed talking to you. I've learned a lot. I mean, maybe I would have to spend maybe $1,000 or more to learn this much from you. But thank you again for sharing all your knowledge, wisdom, and everything about platform engineering. Yeah, anytime. And if people are, you know, curious and want to learn more, you know, platformengineering.org is a great place to start. PlatformCon 23 is coming up. It's free. We're going to have the best platform engineering and DevOps leaders in the world on stage. It's virtual. Awesome.
So you can join from anywhere. So yeah, join us, check it out. And thank you for having me. Thanks, Luca. I'll also paste the link in the description about all this stuff, and you can go through those links. Thank you again, Luca. Awesome. Thank you. Cheers.